Morning, everyone. I'm sure I've actually seen it on some of your faces. You've been playing the one of these things does not match the others at this panel, and it's probably the person seated at the end beside Rick Watts. But I'm grateful to be here, and the words of Dave Dewart from my Regent days run in the back of my head that the most important words in a sentence are always the prepositions. Dave always said that biblical preaching was about, and communicating was about the prepositions with, to, for, and by. And so some of my reflections will be personal, but much of what I say I think reflects the experiences of students at Regent. I had the good fortune to be a student of Gordon's for 2.5 years, at the same time that Charette was at Regent as well in the mid-90s. So people have given Gordon all kinds of credit and blame for several things already this morning. And I'd like to start by saying, just kind of tallying up what Gordon has cost my wife, Kathy. The countless fee books, the bookstore visits, the trip to Regent College to leave behind a great pastoral ministry position and to travel with our children pregnant and move to Vancouver, and then to go back into pastoral ministry, and then to go back to Vancouver to talk to Gordon about doctoral work, and then to sell everything again, including a wonderful family home and a great ministry opportunity to move 4 children that were 7, 5, 3, and 1 to Durham, England. Gordon is to take the credit or the blame for all of that. My reflections are rooted in experiences of several kinds. As an eager, first of all, appreciative reader of how to read the Bible for all it's worth, before I knew the person named on the cover as the author, before I knew he was a Pentecostal, I was sitting in my office as a Pentecostal youth pastor, and for the first time someone was giving me something that I thought went beyond what I was trying to do as games and fun the next night as a youth pastor. Second, as a grad student at Regent College, captured by the sheer passion with which Gordon embraced every class session and every chapel, to hear his voice rise above others as we sang to the glory of God, together as the people of God, ringing, it seemed to me, every ounce of life and meaning from the text, even raising his voice, which has been talked about a lot, but as he articulated arguments for and against the northern and southern theories of providence for Galatians. Thirdly, my appreciation for Gordon as a Pentecostal preacher, which that's sort of the background that I came to Regent from. I have to tell you that Jim Houston was the one that gave me the permission to stay that way. But Gordon was the one that gave me the model to continue forward. As an alum, then later on, who sought Gordon out for counsel. And then fifthly, as a collaborator on some distance ed courses for Regent College, especially on the Book of Revelation, working with some material that Gordon had taught at Regent, and having just freshly finished a PhD on early Jewish apocalyptic and Revelation. It was a delight to meet with Gordon and to work on that material. But I want to pick 5 sort of ideas or terms that I think reflect sort of the theological interactions and the personal interactions that students have had with Gordon, and they give voice to at least the way that I've experienced Gordon in my life. The first is the word intentional. In his insistence on the use of language, whether written or spoken, in his approach to exegesis, in his sense of what it means to be and live as the people of God, or in his commitment that all theology and exegesis ultimately turn back into doxology. Many of those phrases are not my own. I'm just repeating what I heard over the years from Gordon. Those were things that were modeled. And the one instance I think of is Holly and Craig's wedding, where Gordon gave the homily. And because of Gordon's view of women and leadership and honoring and equality, every time he spoke and addressed the congregation, he matched every brother and sister reference with a sister and brother reference. He matched every Craig and Holly reference with a Holly and Craig reference. And not a word was misplaced. He said what he intended to say. So intentionality. Second, Gordon's a man of joy. So many moments of delight and discovery over so many things. Insights on text, celebration of the achievements of his friends and students. But most of all, Gordon's joy at the grace of God. And he would often say, "Students, the grace of God." And then his voice would trail away, as though there was nothing else to be said. I think of his joy in advocating and celebrating the role of women in leadership and ministry. I think as a student, and you know what, and I think an interesting thing as a student, which changes when you become a faculty person, or you move into other areas of life. As a student, you're always kind of interested in what do the profs think of each other, right? How do they interact? And can I get that prof to say something really kind of dirty and nasty on the other prof? And the fascinating thing was to watch Gordon and Bruce Waltke write articles against each other in Crux magazine and debate these issues. And then, as the rumor mill would work among students to hear them, they go out for dinner together. They take their wives to the symphony together. But they're supposed to hate each other because they don't agree on women in leadership. And they modeled what it meant for brothers to live together in unity. It didn't mean that they agreed on everything. Blaine has already referred to the opportunity that I had at a time when Blaine and I were colleagues at Northwest University to honor Gordon in the place where his father had done so much great work. And it was wonderful to watch Gordon walk through the halls, maybe for one last time, and the memories and just the appreciation for what the place had meant to his father was wonderful to see. The third word, so if the first one was intentional and the second one was joy, the third is prophetic. Gordon's approach to theological and exegetical work has always been characterized by a sense of urgency, what I would term a truly Pentecostal sense of mission. In his celebration of the inbreaking kingdom life in so many settings, whether the academy or the church, and his critique of so many sub-biblical practices and principles in the wider church. I'll never forget, the question was once asked of Gordon, because it's easy to appear as though you're an ivory tower professor proclaiming these great kingdom truths, but someone said to Gordon, what would you do if you were actually going to be a pastor again, or if you were going to plant a church? And I'll never forget his answer. He said, I would spend the first year talking about nothing but the kingdom of God. And then he stopped himself and said, no, it would probably have to be longer than a year. I also want to tell you in this third point about Gordon's prophetic role, I want to tell you the parable of the professor and the pastors. During my time at Regent College, I had the opportunity and the privilege to serve in a part-time capacity at a larger Pentecostal church in Vancouver. And for some of that time at the church, I served as a worship leader, which anybody who knows me now would be hard-pressed to believe. But they had a choir with flowing robes, and there was an organ, and it was a great Pentecostal Good Friday service. And I was on the platform group because I was the worship leader that morning. And Gordon was the invited guest speaker. It was a community, several Pentecostal churches together, Good Friday service. And one of the things that had started to really bother me about Pentecostalism was the triumphalism of Friday morning in Holy Week. And I remember Gordon's message, but actually the parable is the story of the offering that morning, because Gordon was given an honorarium that he tucked into his pocket before the service started. And I remember that the platform people also had to pass the offering basket down the line. And I watched as one after another of my pastoral peers and friends put their empty hands into the bucket, because it was supposed to look to everyone like everyone was putting something in. And in the time it took them to do that, the professor had taken out his honorarium, signed the back of it, and stuffed it in the offering plate. And I'll never forget that. The fourth thing about Gordon, so intentional, joyous, prophetic. Gordon's wounded. And I wondered whether I should say this way, but it's been alluded to already. There have been moments in conversations I've had with Gordon in which a deep sadness, almost a grieving over our mutual tradition in Pentecostal circles would emerge. I remember going to him in 1998 and saying, I think I'd like to do a PhD on the book of Revelation. I think I'd like to do it on the Holy Spirit and Pentecostal readings of Revelation. And he looked at me and said, "Ron, do you have a death wish?" And in my naivete, some 16, 17 years ago, I said, "Of course not. I just want to help the tradition. I just want to be faithful and be part of the conversation." And I want to tell you that it doesn't always turn out the way you think it will. Which leads me to my fifth point, and that is that Gordon lived in the tension of the already not yet kingdom and the role of suffering. Coming from a context for me, which was often triumphalist, reductionist, and simplistic, the influence of Gordon, being a voice from within my own tradition, was a biblical realism that embodied what he believed it meant to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the sharing of his sufferings by becoming like him in his death, so somehow to attain the resurrection from the dead. And I know that that's been the recent experience of the family. I've reflected on that in recent experiences that I've walked through. I can't stand before you today and tell you that I have credentials anymore, and yet we live in the tension of the already not yet kingdom. The final thing that I want to say, and come back to the first thing I said about intentionality, is that the first time I heard Gordon say that every word you use matters, I remember thinking at that moment when he said that not one word should not have a specific purpose, that Israel's remembrance of Samuel went something like this. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And Gordon, I've read a lot of Gordon Fee books. I've heard a lot of Gordon Fee lectures. From what I've heard, a word has never fallen to the ground. And I'm grateful to you.
If I could just take advantage of being chair to make a few comments myself.
You got the microphone, brother.
Yeah, I know. You know, as a young man like Murray, left Alberta, went down to the United States to study. Murray was wise, went to California. I decided to jump right into Springfield, Missouri. And so I studied there in an Assemblies of God college. And by the time I'm a senior there, I'm realizing that what I'm seeing here in Springfield is way too much politics, way too little spirit. But around that same time, I hear of this dangerous Pentecostal scholar up in New England at Gordon Conwell. So I thought, well, maybe I'll check that out and see a different side of Pentecostalism. And that was one of the greatest decisions I made at that time in my life. So because at that time, Gordon was someone, at that time, very few people that were sort of notable people that were in-your-face Pentecostals at the same time, as Gordon, in-your-face is okay to say. but anyway, so I go up, and Gordon was a great influence on me at that time. Sven and others have mentioned that phrase, scholarship on fire, and that was certainly my experience. A lot of people who had Gordon as students mentioned the rigor that Gordon brings to, I mean, the joy, but also that rigor that Gordon brings to things. And I remember at the time, this is when he was still working on his 1 Corinthians commentary, but I remember him saying, for example, a good exegetical education is reading C.K. Barrett's commentary on 1 Corinthians. And I took that to heart, but then as soon as Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians comes out, I get to alter that, saying a good exegetical education is reading Gordon Fee's commentary on 1 Corinthians. And with Gordon, I had the benefit of, as all of us here, I had the benefit of hearing him in lectures, but also since then continuing to be fed by him in terms of his scholarship. And so even to this day, and this is maybe what good professors, how they continue to haunt you for the rest of your life. Every time I write something academically today, I've sort of Gordon over one shoulder and Andrew Lincoln, who's my doctoral supervisor, over the other shoulder. And it's kind of nice to have that, because you're kind of realizing, is this the kind of thing that they would pass off on? Okay. As far as the fire aspects of that, my best memories from Gordon Conwell are as one of Gordon's advisees. Oftentimes he and Maudine would invite the advisees over. And again, it was never just a social event. It was always a worship service combined with social event. So some of my greatest, fondest memories of Gordon is being in his house there, he and Maudine leading us in worship songs, and Gordon, just the tears coming down Gordon's cheeks. And I realized that, again, that's where I think I saw the heart of Pentecostalism. And I can say to this day that the reason why Ron sort of alluded a bit to his difficulties, part of the reason why I've kind of stuck it out with, good and bad, with teaching within a Pentecostal context, is really down to Gordon and then my friend Chris Thomas. I would say that those two people have kind of made it possible for me to, despite everything, stay within that kind of framework. And because of that critical loyalty that Gordon evinces throughout his life. Okay, let's take a minute or two just to stand up.